Clara woke up to the sound of her alarm blaring, her eyes heavy from another restless night. She swung her legs off the bed, careful not to wake the three little bodies still sprawled across the thin mattress beside her. The triplets had kicked off their shared blanket, their small limbs tangled in sleep. She sighed, pulling it back over them before getting up. The cold of the tile floor stung her bare feet as she walked to the kitchen. She opened a half-empty box of cereal, poured the last bit into a bowl, and searched for the milk. No milk. Clara bit her lip, frustration bubbling up, and settled on pouring some water in the bowl. It wasn't ideal, but it was all they had. "Mom, what's for breakfast?" One of the triplets, Lucas, asked from behind her, rubbing his eyes. "Cereal," Clara said, forcing a smile as she set the bowl on the table. Lucas frowned at the watery mix, but said nothing. He knew better by now. She ruffled his hair. "Eat up, we have to go." She hurried them along, helping Lucas, Leo, and Lila into their clothes. The kids were mostly self-sufficient at 5 years old, but it still took patience to get them ready on time. Socks were always missing, shirts backward, shoes untied. She moved through the small apartment, gathering what she could. Her own reflection caught her eye in the bathroom mirror. Tired, older than 34, with dark circles under her eyes, she turned away quickly. They finally got out the door, Clara's hands full with bags and little fingers grasping her sleeves. They walked quickly to the bus stop, Clara trying to ignore the time ticking away. She could feel herself getting later by the second. The bus rolled up, and they climbed on. Clara counted the coins in her pocket before paying for her ticket. "Mom, are we late again?" Leo asked, looking up at her. "Maybe a little," she answered, her voice tight. She didn't want to lie, but she also didn't want to scare them. They arrived at the daycare, and Clara hugged each of the triplets tightly before rushing out. She could feel the tension building in her chest as she ran for the supermarket where she worked. Her manager was waiting at the entrance when she arrived. "You're late again, Clara," he said, his arms crossed. "I'm really sorry, Mr. Silva. The kids, the bus," she stammered. "Excuses won't keep you employed. One more time, and that's it. Understand?" he snapped. Clara nodded, swallowing the urge to say more. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with the rent past due and no one else to rely on. She quickly moved to her post at the cash register, plastering on a smile for the customers. The hours dragged by, her feet aching as she scanned items, repeated prices, and bagged groceries. Her thoughts drifted to the kids, hoping they were okay at daycare, hoping they weren't hungry. When her shift ended, Clara gathered her things, the tension still lodged in her chest. She headed to pick up the kids, her mind spinning with everything she still had to do. Dinner, laundry, bedtime, then the worry about the rent, always there, a dull ache in the background. The daycare worker gave her a sympathetic look as she signed the kids out. Clara tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Everything okay?" the worker asked. "Yeah, we're fine," Clara replied quickly, taking Lucas, Leo, and Lila's hands. She didn't want to talk about it. They walked home, and Clara kept her head down. She knew the neighbors were watching. Everyone knew she was struggling, and she hated the pity in their eyes. Once home, she put on a brave face for the kids, pulling out what she could from the fridge. A can of beans, some rice, she cooked in silence, listening to the triplets laugh as they played with their worn-out toys. "Dinner's ready," she called, setting their plates down. They ate quietly, Lila tugging at her shirt. "Mom, when will we have dessert again?" Clara swallowed hard. "Soon, baby. Maybe soon." After dinner, Clara helped them wash up, brushing their teeth and combing their hair. She tucked them into bed, sitting beside them until they drifted off. The day's exhaustion finally hit her, and she sank onto the old couch. She put her head in her hands, letting out a shaky breath. She saw the envelope on the counter, the eviction notice. Clara grabbed it, reading the words again, hoping they'd changed. They hadn't. She was 3 months behind. The deadline was approaching, and she didn't have the money. She crumpled the paper, tears pricking her eyes. She couldn't let the kids see her like this. She needed to be strong for them. Clara thought of him, of the man who had left her to do this alone. He hadn't cared when she told him she was pregnant. He had walked out without a second thought, leaving her standing in their empty apartment, holding her belly. She shook her head, pushing the thoughts away, but the notice felt like a weight in her hands. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The kids needed her to figure it out, but she didn't know if she could. Clara closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She had to find a way. She couldn't lose everything. Not now. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, and she looked at the screen. It was an ad. Some fancy wedding being shown on TV. Clara was about to ignore it when she recognized the face. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him, her ex. He was smiling, arm in arm with a woman dressed in white. The headline announcing their wedding. Clara stared, her heart pounding. He was here, in the same city, about to marry into wealth. Her hands shook as she watched, anger rising inside her. He had abandoned her, left her with nothing. And here he was, dressed in a suit, grinning like he had no care in the world. She looked at her sleeping children, their faces soft and peaceful. They deserved better. They deserved something from him. Clara stood up, her jaw clenched. She didn't know what she would do, but she knew she had to try. For them, she turned off the TV, her hands still trembling. Tomorrow, she would make a plan. She would find him. She would demand what was right for her children. For now, she just needed to make it through the night. Clara couldn't sleep. She lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, the glow of the streetlight outside casting shadows across the room. Her mind kept replaying the images of her ex, his smile, his arm around that wealthy woman. He looked so content, so far away from the life she was living. The eviction notice sat crumpled on the table, a cruel reminder of everything she couldn't escape. She checked on the triplets, tucking the blanket around their small bodies. They looked so innocent, so unaware of the world around them. Clara felt her chest tighten with a mix of love and fear. She had to protect them. She had to do something. As she watched their faces, she decided she couldn't keep hiding from him. She had to confront him. She had to make him take responsibility, no matter how much it hurt her pride. The next morning, Clara moved through her routine in a fog. She dressed the kids, made breakfast with whatever was left in the cupboard, and got them ready for daycare. She was quiet, her thoughts heavy with the decision she had made during the long, sleepless night. "Mom, are you okay?" Lila asked, her eyes wide. Clara forced a smile. "Yeah, sweetie. I'm just thinking, don't worry about me." She walked them to daycare, hugged them goodbye, and then stood outside for a long moment, her heart pounding. She couldn't turn back now. She had to find him. Clara took a deep breath and set off, her footsteps quick and determined. She didn't have an exact plan, but she knew where the wedding would be. It had been in the ad. The grand church downtown, the one with the tall spire and stained glass windows. She'd seen it 100 times, but never imagined she'd be going there like this. She reached the church, its massive doors already decorated with flowers and ribbons. People were bustling about, setting up for what would clearly be an extravagant affair. Clara stood across the street, staring at the scene. A pang of nervousness shot through her chest, making her doubt herself. She thought about turning back, going home to the kids, pretending none of this mattered. But then she remembered the landlord's ultimatum, the way her boss had looked at her with disdain. She thought about her children, how they deserved a roof over their heads, food that wasn't running out, a mother who wasn't constantly struggling just to keep them afloat. Clara clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. She had to go through with this. She stayed there for a while, watching the preparations, until a taxi pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and there he was, her ex. Clara's stomach turned. He looked different. Expensive suit, new haircut, the kind of confidence that came from having money. He got out, helped the bride-to-be step out, and Clara watched as they laughed together, completely unaware of her presence. She felt a rush of anger. He looked so happy, like he'd never had a care in the world. He hadn't seen her, hadn't noticed the person he'd left to deal with the mess he walked away from. She stepped forward, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to face him now. She waited until he was distracted, talking to one of the wedding planners, then crossed the street quickly, dodging cars, her eyes fixed on him. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, loud and fast. She didn't think about what she would say. She just needed to get close enough to make him see her, to make him listen. As she got closer, one of the security guards stepped into her path. "Excuse me, ma'am, you can't—" "Get out of my way," Clara snapped, her voice shaking but determined. She tried to move past, but he blocked her again. "Ma'am, this is a private—" "That man," Clara pointed, her voice rising. "That man is the father of my children." Her voice broke a little as she spoke. The guard hesitated, looking back at her ex-Tao, confusion on his face. Clara used the moment to push forward, getting around the guard and closer to the man she had once loved. He turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw her. For a split second, there was recognition, and then it was gone, replaced by annoyance. "Clara?" he said, his voice low and incredulous. "What are you doing here?" Clara swallowed hard, her throat tight. "We need to talk. You can't keep ignoring us. I need help. The kids need you." His eyes darted around, seeing people looking their way. "This isn't the time or place," he said, his voice dropping to a hiss. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You shouldn't be here. You're making a scene." Clara clenched her fist, her eyes stinging. "I don't care if it's a scene. You can't just walk away from your kids. You left us. You have to take responsibility." His jaw tightened, his eyes growing cold. "We've been over this. I don't owe you anything. This is my life now," he said, gesturing to the church behind him, to the woman he was about to marry. "You need to leave, now." Clara shook her head, her heart pounding. She could feel tears threatening, but she refused to let them fall. "Please, just help us. The kids deserve something from you. They're your children." He looked at her, his face a mask of irritation. "You think you can just show up and demand things? This is my life now. You need to move on." He turned away, signaling to one of the guards, "Get her out of here." Clara's heart dropped as the guard approached, his hands reaching for her arm. She pulled back, her voice rising in desperation. "They're your kids. You can't just pretend we don't exist." The bride, hearing the commotion, turned, her eyes wide with confusion. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice sharp, the smile on her face fading. Clara's ex gave a strained smile, shaking his head. "No one, just someone from the past. She's leaving." The guard pulled Clara away, her feet stumbling on the pavement, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. She struggled, trying to break free, but it was useless. Her voice cracked as she called out one last time, "Please, for your kids." But he didn't turn around. He kept his back to her, his attention focused on the wedding preparations. Clara's heart felt like it was breaking all over again. She let the guard guide her away, her legs shaky, her breaths coming in quick, painful gasps. She was left standing on the sidewalk, the bustling street behind her, the grand church in front of her, a world she could never be part of. Clara wiped her tears, her hands trembling. She had tried, she had done everything she could think of, and he still didn't care. She turned and began to walk away, her head bowed. She needed to get back to her children. She needed to find a way to fix this on her own. The thought of them waiting for her, not knowing any of this, gave her a small sense of purpose. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. As she walked, Clara's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from her landlord. The final warning. Either she paid or she was out. Clara closed her eyes, the weight of it all crushing down on her shoulders. She needed to think. She needed to figure something out. She couldn't lose their home. She walked faster, the determination starting to build again beneath the exhaustion. She wasn't giving up. Not yet. The next day dawned with a dull sky, matching Clara's mood. She hadn't slept well, her mind replaying everything that had happened outside the church. She could still feel the guard's hand on her arm, her ex's dismissive gaze. Every memory stung, and the weight of failure sat heavy on her chest. But there was no time for her to feel weak. She had children to care for, and the clock on their rent was ticking down fast. She dressed the kids in silence, her mind made up. Today, she wasn't going to let things end the way they did yesterday. She had nothing left to lose. As they walked to the daycare, Lila tugged on her sleeve. "Mom, are we going to see Daddy today?" Lila asked, her innocent eyes hopeful. Clara paused, her throat tightening. She hadn't realized how much the kids had heard or understood the day before. "Maybe, sweetheart, but no promises, okay?" She tried to smile, though it was more like a grimace. "For now, I need you to be good at daycare. Mommy's got something to take care of." "Okay," Lila said, nodding with her usual trust. Clara hugged each of them at the daycare door, her heart heavy. They deserved so much more than this. She turned quickly before the tears could spill, determined to make today different. She caught the bus downtown, the same one that took her to work, but instead of getting off at her stop, she rode it all the way to the grand church. The wedding ceremony would start in a few hours, and Clara knew this was her last chance to make her voice heard. She didn't have a plan, just a desperate sense of purpose that propelled her forward. Clara got off the bus and walked toward the church. The decorations were all in place now, with flowers everywhere, and more guests were arriving, dressed in elegant clothes that made Clara's jeans and worn-out coat seem even more out of place. She ignored the looks people gave her as she made her way up the steps. When she reached the entrance, a guard immediately stepped forward, blocking her path. It was the same guard as before. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I need to talk to him," Clara said, her voice steady. She could feel her heart pounding, her hands shaking, but she refused to show fear. "He's the father of my children. I have every right to be here." "Look, I get it," the guard said, lowering his voice, "but this is a private event. I can't let you in." Clara clenched her jaw. She felt the desperation rise in her chest, her eyes burning. She wasn't leaving, not without him acknowledging what he'd done. "Please," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "just let me speak to him." The guard shook his head, but before he could say anything more, Clara saw him, her ex, standing near the front of the church, talking to one of the guests. He hadn't noticed her yet. Clara took a deep breath, and before the guard could react, she stepped around him, pushing her way through the people gathered near the doors. "Hey!" the guard called, but Clara ignored him. She moved quickly, her eyes locked on her ex. She heard the whispers around her, people staring, but she kept walking, her heart pounding louder with each step. When she was just a few feet away, she called out, "Matthew!" Her voice rang out, sharp and loud. He turned, his face going pale as he saw her. The conversation around them seemed to stop, people turning to see what was happening. Clara could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't care. She only saw him. Matthew's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "Clara, what are you doing here?" he said, his voice low, controlled. Clara stepped closer, her hands trembling. "You can't keep ignoring us. You left me alone with your children. They need you." Matthew glanced around, clearly uncomfortable. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I told you yesterday, this isn't the place for this. You need to leave, now." Clara shook her head, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "No, you don't get to tell me to leave. Not again. You can't pretend we don't exist. The kids deserve better. They deserve something from you." Matthew's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "This is my life now," he said, gesturing toward the church, toward the guests, the decorations. "You're not part of it anymore. I've moved on." Clara felt her heart twist at his words, the pain sharp and cutting, but she stood her ground. "You can move on from me, but you don't get to move on from them. They're your children, Matthew. You owe them something." Matthew glanced around again, clearly worried about the attention they were drawing. He took a step back, signaling to the security guard. "Get her out of here," he said, his voice cold. The guard moved forward, his hand on Clara's arm, but she pulled away, her voice rising. "Do you hear me, Matthew? They're your kids. You can't just run away." The bride, standing a few feet away, turned at the commotion, her eyes wide with confusion. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice sharp, the smile on her face fading. Matthew forced a smile, his face flushed. "No one. She's no one. She's leaving." Clara's heart broke at his words. The guard pulled her back, and she let him, her feet stumbling, her body feeling heavy. She watched as Matthew turned his back on her, on their children, his attention focused on the woman standing beside him, on the life he'd chosen over them. The guard led her out of the churchyard, his grip firm but not rough. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quietly as they reached the sidewalk. Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She turned away from the church, her vision blurred by tears she couldn't hold back any longer. She had tried. She had done everything she could. And still, he had turned his back on them. She walked down the street, her legs feeling weak, her heart heavy. She needed to get back to her children. They were waiting for her, and they didn't need to see her like this. She wiped her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't let them see her broken. As she turned the corner, she felt her phone buzz in her pocket. She pulled it out, her hands still trembling. It was a message from her friend, Sarah. "Clara, I heard what happened. Are you okay? Please call me. We need to talk. It's important." Clara stared at the message, her mind too clouded to think clearly. She didn't know if she had the energy to talk, to explain everything, but she knew Sarah wouldn't have sent the message unless it was serious. She took a deep breath and dialed the number. Sarah picked up on the first ring. "Clara, are you okay? Where are you?" I'm fine," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm heading back home." "Listen, you need to know something," Sarah said, her voice urgent. "Matthew's planning to leave the country. I heard it from someone at the office. He's trying to avoid any legal issue. He's leaving right after the wedding." Clara's heart sank. She felt her knees buckle and she grabbed onto a nearby railing to steady herself. "He's leaving," she whispered. "Yes, he's trying to get away before you can do anything," Sarah said. "Clara, you can't let him go. You have to fight this." Clara closed her eyes, the weight of the news pressing down on her. She had tried everything, and now he was just going to run away. But as she stood there, the railing cold under her hand, she felt something inside her harden. She wasn't giving up. Not yet. "Thank you, Sarah," she said, her voice steadier. "I have to go now." She hung up, her mind racing. She had one more chance, one more shot at making him take responsibility, and she was going to take it. Clara's feet felt like they were moving on autopilot as she hurried down the busy streets, her mind racing with thoughts she could barely contain. She couldn't let Matthew leave the country. If he did, she'd never get the chance to hold him accountable. Her children would grow up without any of the support they deserved. The thought alone made her stomach twist, and fear gripped her chest like a vice. She got home to find her neighbor Mrs. Lopez, a kind, older woman, waiting near her door. "Clara," she called out, her voice laced with concern. "I saw you on the news this morning." Clara froze for a moment, a sinking feeling spreading in her stomach. "The news?" Mrs. Lopez nodded, her eyes soft. "That wedding of your ex, there were cameras everywhere. I can't believe what they did to you, throwing you out like that. Are you okay, dear?" Clara forced a smile, though it was weak and fleeting. "I'm fine, Mrs. Lopez, thank you." She didn't have time for the pity, as well-meaning as it was. She just needed to see her children, to hold them, and gather the strength to face what was coming next. She hurried inside, dropping her bag on the table, her eyes immediately scanning the room. The triplets were sitting on the floor, playing with a set of mismatched toys. "Mommy!" Lucas said, his face lighting up as he saw her. He ran to her, wrapping his small arms around her legs. Clara's heart lifted for a moment, the warmth of their little bodies pressing into her, giving her the smallest bit of solace. "How are my babies?" she asked, her voice shaky. She bent down, hugging each of them, holding on for longer than usual. "Are we going to see Daddy again?" Leo asked, his voice filled with hope. Clara's breath caught. She swallowed, trying to steady herself. I don't know, baby, but Mommy's going to make sure everything is okay. I promise." She stood, her heart heavy as she glanced at the clock. She didn't have time to linger. She needed to think of what to do. She had to stop Matthew before it was too late. After putting a simple dinner together for the kids, Clara called her friend Sarah. She needed more details. As the phone rang, Clara paced the small kitchen, her nerves fraying. When Sarah finally answered, Clara blurted, "I need to know everything. When is he leaving?" "Clara, I just found out from someone in accounting," Sarah said, her voice tense. "They said he's booked a flight to Europe tonight. After the wedding, he's heading straight to the airport." Clara closed her eyes, the information hitting her like a punch to the gut. She didn't have much time. "Thank you, Sarah. I don't know what I'm going to do, but thank you." "Are you sure you're okay, Clara?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with concern. "I can come over, help you with the kids." "No," Clara said, her voice firm. "I need to do this on my own." She hung up, her eyes focused on her children playing in the living room. She had to go to the airport. She had to find Matthew and stop him before he disappeared. The thought of confronting him again made her stomach turn. But there was no other choice. She packed a small bag, grabbing snacks and water for the kids. She knew she'd have to take them with her. There was no one she could leave them with, and she couldn't risk losing this chance. Once she was ready, Clara knelt down in front of the triplets, her hands on their small shoulders. "We're going on an adventure, okay?" she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I need you all to be on your best behavior. Can you do that for Mommy?" The three nodded, their eyes wide. They didn't understand, but they trusted her. That trust was everything to Clara, and it fueled her determination. She gathered them up, taking their small hands in hers as they left the apartment. They caught the bus to the airport, the ride long and tense. Clara's heart pounded the entire time, her eyes darting to the clock, counting down the minutes. The triplets were unusually quiet, sensing her unease. They arrived at the airport, the bustling terminal filled with people rushing in every direction. Clara clutched the children's hands tighter, her eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of Matthew. She moved quickly, pulling the kids along, her breath coming in short, anxious gasps. She spotted him near the security checkpoint, his back to her, his arm around his new wife. Clara's pulse quickened. This was it. She couldn't let him go. She approached, weaving through the crowd, her children struggling to keep up with her quick pace. As she got closer, she called out his name, her voice cracking. "Matthew!" He turned, his face paling as he saw her. His eyes widened, and for a moment, there was something almost like fear in them. Clara took a deep breath, stepping forward. "You're not leaving," she said, her voice trembling but loud enough for him to hear. "Not without taking responsibility." Matthew glanced around, his face flushed with irritation. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, stepping toward her. "You can't just show up like this." Clara shook her head, her grip tightening on the children's hands. "You can't run away. They need you, Matthew. You can't just abandon us again." His eyes narrowed, his voice lowering to a hiss. "I told you, this is my life now. I've moved on. You need to leave before you make a scene." Clara's heart pounded, her throat tight. She could feel the tears threatening, but she refused to let them fall. "I don't care if I make a scene. You have children, Matthew. You owe them something." He glanced at his wife, who was watching with wide, confused eyes. "Who is she?" the woman asked, her voice sharp. Matthew clenched his jaw. "She's no one," he said, his voice cold. He looked back at Clara. "You need to leave now." Clara shook her head, her voice rising. "No, I'm not leaving until you agree to help. They're your kids, Matthew. You can't just pretend they don't exist." People were starting to stare, their eyes flicking between Clara and Matthew, whispers spreading through the crowd. Clara could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't care. She only saw him, the man who had left her to struggle alone. "Please, Matthew," she said, her voice breaking. "For them." Matthew looked away, his face hardening. He turned to the security guards nearby, signaling to them. "Get her out of here," he said, his voice cold and final. Clara's heart sank as the guards approached, their hands reaching for her arms. She struggled, her voice rising in desperation. "You can't do this. They're your children." The triplets began to cry, their small voices filling the space around them. Clara's heart broke at the sound, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. She pulled her children close, holding onto them as the guards tried to pull her away. One of the guards spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Ma'am, you need to leave." Clara looked at Matthew one last time, her eyes filled with pain and anger. He didn't look at her. He kept his back to her, his eyes focused on the security line ahead. The guards pulled her away, and Clara let them, her feet stumbling as she held her children close. The triplets clung to her, their cries breaking her heart. She had tried, she had done everything she could, and still, he had turned his back on them. She was led out of the terminal, the cold air hitting her face as they stepped outside. Clara sank to her knees, her children huddled around her, their small hands clutching at her coat. She held them, her heart aching, her tears falling freely. "Mommy, are we going home?" Lila asked, her voice small and scared. Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She didn't know what they would do next. She didn't know how they would make it, but she knew she couldn't give up. Not now, not when her children needed her more than ever. She stood, her legs shaky, her arms around the triplets. "Yes, baby," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We're going home." Clara spent the rest of the day trying to regain her composure. Back in the small apartment, she washed the dishes quietly while the triplets sat in the living room, their eyes still swollen from crying earlier. Their laughter and energy were gone, replaced by confused looks and quiet questions. Clara's heart broke every time one of them asked, "When will we see Daddy again?" And she had no answers. That night, Clara took the triplets to bed early. She tucked them in gently, brushing their hair away from their faces, her fingers lingering on their cheeks. They looked up at her, their innocence cutting her like a knife. "Mommy, are we in trouble?" Leo asked, his small voice trembling. His big eyes looked up at her, seeking comfort. Clara forced a smile, though her chest was tight with fear and uncertainty. "No, sweetheart, you're not in trouble. Everything's going to be okay." "Are you sad, Mommy?" Lucas added, his eyes wide, filled with worry that no 5-year-old should ever have to feel. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. She couldn't let them see her like this. They needed her to be strong. "I'm just tired, baby. You all need to sleep, okay? Mommy's here." She waited until they drifted off to sleep, their breaths evening out, their small hands relaxing. Only then did she let her shoulders drop, her composure slipping away. She went into the living room, sinking onto the couch, her face in her hands. She felt the weight of everything: Matthew's rejection, the looming eviction, her children's innocent faces, all pressing down on her. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable, her sobs muffled in the emptiness of the room. It felt like she was breaking apart, piece by piece. She had tried so hard, given everything she had, and it still wasn't enough. Clara curled into herself on the couch, the cold creeping through the thin walls of the apartment. She wanted to scream, to hit something, anything to let out the rage and helplessness inside her. But she stayed quiet. The only sound in the apartment, the low hum of the refrigerator. Hours later, there was a knock at the door. Clara lifted her head, her eyes swollen and red. She wasn't expecting anyone. She wiped her face, got up, and opened the door to find her mother standing there. Her mother's eyes swept over Clara, and the disapproval in them was immediate. "Clara," her mother said, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I heard what happened at the church." Clara closed her eyes, the shame washing over her. "Mom, I don't need this right now." Her mother stepped inside, her voice sharp. "You made a fool of yourself. You embarrassed all of us. What were you thinking?" Clara felt her jaw tighten, her fists clenching at her sides. "I was thinking about my kids," she said, her voice breaking. "I was thinking about how I'm supposed to keep a roof over their heads when I have nothing left." Her mother sighed, shaking her head. "There are other ways, Clara. You can't go running after a man who clearly doesn't want to be part of your life. You have to accept that." Clara felt the tears welling again, her chest tight. "I know he doesn't want us, but what am I supposed to do, Mom? I'm out of option. I'm losing everything." Her mother's face softened slightly, though the sternness remained. "You have to be smarter, Clara. You can't let your emotions control you. You're not just living for yourself anymore." Clara nodded, the weight of her mother's words sinking in. She knew all of that. She knew she had to be better, stronger, but knowing it didn't make it any easier. "I'm trying, Mom," she whispered. "I'm trying so hard." Her mother sighed, her eyes glancing toward the bedroom where the triplets were asleep. "I know, Clara, but you have to think about them first, always." Clara didn't say anything, just nodded. Her mother left soon after, leaving Clara feeling even more alone. She closed the door behind her, leaning her forehead against the wood, her eyes closing. She needed to think clearly, to find a way out of this mess. But right now, all she wanted was sleep, an escape from the nightmare that was her reality. She went back to the couch, pulling a thin blanket over herself. The apartment was quiet, the kids' gentle breathing, the only sound that brought her any comfort. Clara stared at the ceiling, her mind racing, her heart aching. She thought of Matthew, of his face when he turned away from her at the airport. He had looked at her like she was nothing, like she was something beneath his notice. The rejection still stung, but what hurt more was knowing that he had rejected their children, that he had chosen to walk away from them. She stayed awake most of the night, her thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and anger. When she finally drifted off to sleep, it was fitful, filled with dreams of losing the apartment, of being on the streets with the children, nowhere to go. The next morning, Clara woke with a pounding headache, her body heavy with exhaustion. She forced herself up, moving through the motions of making breakfast, getting the kids dressed. The eviction notice was still on the counter, a constant reminder of everything that was slipping away. The kids ate quietly, their eyes flicking to Clara, sensing her mood. She tried to smile at them, to make the morning feel normal, but her face felt stiff, her heart heavy. When they were ready, Clara took them to daycare, her steps slow and reluctant. She wanted to stay with them, to keep them close, but she had to go to work. She needed the money, even if it was barely enough to make a difference. She hugged each of them tightly at the daycare door, her heart aching as she let them go. "Be good, okay?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We will, Mommy," Lila said, her small hand touching Clara's cheek. "Don't be sad." Clara nodded, her eyes stinging. "I'll try, sweetheart. I love you all so much." She walked away, her chest tight, her eyes blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She had to keep moving, had to keep fighting. For them. At work, Clara moved through her shift in a daze, her body on autopilot as she rang up customers, bagged groceries, forced a smile. Her boss eyed her warily, as if waiting for her to slip up, to give him a reason to let her go. Clara kept her head down, her focus on getting through the day. During her break, she sat in the small, cramped break room, her head in her hands. She felt the weight of everything pressing down on, and for a moment, she thought about giving up, about just letting go, letting whatever happened happen. But the thought of her children's faces kept her from that edge. She couldn't give up, not for herself, but for them. As she sat there, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Clara pulled it out, her eyes widening as she read the message from Sarah. "Clara, he's leaving tonight. If you want to stop him, you have to do it now." Clara's heart pounded, her hands shaking as she read the words again. Tonight. He was leaving tonight. If she didn't do something now, it would be too late. She had one last chance to make him take responsibility, to fight for her children. She took a deep breath, her mind made up. She couldn't let him leave, not without a fight. She had tried everything, and this was her last shot. She stood, her legs shaky, her breath coming in quick, anxious gasps. She had to go. She had to find him before it was too late. She clocked out of work, her boss calling after her, but she ignored him. She had more important things to deal with. She caught the bus back to the daycare, her heart pounding the entire way. She needed to get the kids, and then she would find Matthew. She would make him face what he had done. She picked up the triplets, her eyes red, her hands shaking as she signed them out. The daycare worker gave her a concerned look, but Clara ignored it, gathering the kids close, hugging them tightly. "We're going on another adventure," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "We have to go see Daddy one more time." The kids nodded, their eyes wide, trusting her completely. Clara took a deep breath, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. She wasn't giving up. Not yet. Not when her children needed her the most. Clara arrived back at the apartment with the triplets, her mind racing. The landlord was waiting by her door, arms crossed, his expression grim. Clara's heart sank when she saw him. She knew what was coming, but she had no choice but to face it head on. "Clara?" the landlord said, his voice carrying a mix of impatience and frustration. "I need that rent payment, or you and your kids are out. I've been more than fair." "You know I have." Clara swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to the ground. She felt Leo grip her hand tighter, sensing the tension. She looked back at the landlord, her voice trembling. "Please, Mr. Johnson, just give me a little more time. I'm trying. I promise you I am." The landlord shook his head, his face softening slightly, but only for a moment. "I'm sorry, Clara, but you're 3 months behind. I can't let this go on any longer. If I don't have payment by the end of the week, you need to vacate." Clara nodded, the words hitting her like a punch to the gut. She pulled the children closer, their small bodies huddling against her legs. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. She watched him turn and walk away, his steps echoing in the hallway. Clara took a deep breath, her eyes closing for a moment, trying to hold herself together. She couldn't break down now, not in front of the kids. She had to be strong, even if every part of her felt like it was shattering. Once inside, she set the children down, their eyes wide and worried. She forced a smile, though it felt fragile. "Okay, who wants a snack?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. The triplets nodded, though they still looked uncertain. Clara went to the kitchen, rummaging through the nearly empty cabinets. She found a half-eaten loaf of bread and some peanut butter, enough to make a few small sandwiches. She spread the peanut butter on the bread, her hands trembling as she did. "Here you go," she said, setting the plates down in front of them. She watched as they ate quietly, their eyes flicking to her now and then. She knew they could sense her worry, no matter how much she tried to hide it. After they finished eating, Clara sat down on the floor with them, pulling them into her arms. She held them close, her heart aching. She didn't know how she was going to fix this. She had no idea where they would go if they were evicted, but she knew she had to find a way. For them. "Mommy?" Lila said, her voice soft. "Are we going to be okay?" Clara kissed the top of her head, her eyes stinging with tears. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "We're going to be okay. I promise." She pulled away, standing up, her resolve hardening. She had one chance left. She had to find Matthew before he left the country. She needed to get him to help. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about her children, and she couldn't let them down. She packed a small bag, throwing in what little she could. Some snacks, a few bottles of water, and a couple of their toys. She knew it might be a long night, and she wanted to be ready. She dressed the children in their jackets, their eyes wide as they watched her, sensing the urgency. "Mommy, are we going to see Daddy again?" Lucas asked, his small voice filled with hope. Clara knelt down, her hands resting on his shoulders. She looked into his eyes, her heart breaking a little at the hope she saw there. "Yes, baby. We're going to see Daddy. But I need you all to be very good and stay close to me, okay?" They nodded, their small hands reaching for hers. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she led them out the door. She couldn't afford to hesitate now. She had to do this. They caught the bus to the airport. The ride long and tense. Clara's eyes kept darting to the clock, watching the minutes tick by, her stomach twisting with anxiety. She kept the children close, their heads resting on her shoulders as the bus moved through the dark streets. When they finally arrived at the airport, Clara's heart was pounding. She led the children through the bustling terminal, her eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of Matthew. People were rushing in every direction, the noise and chaos overwhelming. Clara tightened her grip on her children's hands, her eyes flicking from one face to another. She spotted him at the far end of the terminal, standing by the check-in counter with his new wife. They were laughing, oblivious to everything else around them. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her steps quickening as she pulled the children along. "Matthew!" she called out, her voice shaky but loud enough for him to hear. He turned, his eyes widening when he saw her. His expression shifted from surprise to irritation in an instant. He stepped away from his wife, his face flushed with anger as Clara approached. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, his eyes darting around, clearly embarrassed by her presence. Clara took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "You can't leave, Matthew. Not like this. You have responsibilities. These are your children," she said, her voice trembling. Matthew shook his head, his jaw clenched. "We've been over this, Clara. I told you, I've moved on. You need to let it go." Clara felt the anger rise inside her, her hands trembling. "How can you say that? They are your children. You can't just pretend they don't exist." Matthew glanced at his wife, who was watching them with a frown, her arms crossed. "This isn't the time or place," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You need to leave, now." Clara shook her head, her eyes stinging with tears. "I won't leave, not until you do something. They need you, Matthew. They need your help." Matthew's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. He turned to the security guard nearby, signaling to him. "Get her out of here," he said, his voice cold. The guard approached, his hand on Clara's arm, and she felt her heart sink. She looked up at Matthew, her voice breaking. "Please, Matthew, for your kids, just help us." He didn't look at her. He turned his back, his attention shifting to his wife, his body language dismissive. Clara felt the tears spill down her cheeks, her heart shattering all over again. The guard pulled her back, and she let him, her legs weak, her children clinging to her, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. Clara's heart broke at the sight of their tears, her chest aching with a pain so deep, it felt like she couldn't breathe. They were led out of the terminal, the cold night air hitting Clara's face as they stepped outside. She sank to her knees, pulling the children close, their small bodies trembling against her. She held them, her own tears falling freely, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had lost. "Mommy, why is Daddy mad?" Leo asked, his small voice trembling. Clara shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. She kissed his forehead, her arms wrapped tightly around him. "I don't know, baby. I don't know." They stayed there for a long moment, Clara's heart breaking with every sob that escaped her children. She had tried everything, given everything she had, and still, it hadn't been enough. She didn't know what to do next, where to go, how to keep going. She stood slowly, her legs shaky, her arms around her children. She looked up at the airport, the lights bright against the dark sky. Matthew was gone. He had turned his back on them for good. But Clara knew one thing. She wasn't going to let this break her. She had 3 beautiful children who needed her, and she was going to fight for them, no matter what. She didn't know how she was going to do it, but she knew she couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. She took a deep breath, her arms tightening around her children. "We're going home," she whispered, her voice steady, despite the tears still falling. "And we're going to be okay, I promise." Clara wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The next morning came, and the reality of Matthew leaving hit her like a wall of ice. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the 3 small lives depending on her. They were innocent, and they deserved better. This was her last chance, and she wasn't going to let it slip through her fingers. The day moved in a blur. Clara had spent the morning pacing in the small apartment, her mind reeling with thoughts and plans that barely formed before falling apart. But one thing was certain, she had to confront him, and she had to do it now, before it was too late. She couldn't let the opportunity slip by. When it was time to leave again, she packed the kids quickly, telling them it was another adventure. She put on their jackets, tied their small shoes, and gathered them close. She felt her heart pounding in her chest as they left the apartment. This was it. This was her last shot. The bus ride to the airport felt longer this time. The anxiety made every minute crawl by as if time was dragging on purpose. Clara could feel her stomach twisting, her palms sweaty as she held the kids close. She kept looking at the clock, praying that she wouldn't be too late. The triplets were unusually quiet, sensing their mother's tension and feeding off her fear. When they arrived, Clara's determination turned her fear into resolve. She moved quickly through the crowded terminal, her eyes scanning for Matthew. Her heart pounded in her ears, her breath coming in short bursts. She couldn't afford to be scared anymore. She couldn't afford to let him get away, not without doing everything she could to fight for her kids. Finally, she spotted him. Matthew was standing in line at the security checkpoint, his wife beside him, their luggage stacked neatly on a cart. They were smiling, sharing a laugh as if they didn't have a care in the world. Clara's heart clenched at the sight, a mix of anger and despair washing over her. She pulled the kids closer, her steps quickening. She wasn't going to let him leave without facing her. Without facing them, she approached, weaving through the crowd, the kids struggling to keep up with her pace. "Matthew!" she called out, her voice cracking. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make him turn. His face went pale when he saw her, his eyes widening in shock. He stepped back, his smile vanishing instantly. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, stepping toward her, his eyes darting around, clearly uncomfortable with the scene she was about to cause. Clara took a deep breath, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. "You can't just leave, Matthew. Not like this. You have responsibilities. These are your children." Her voice trembled, but she kept it steady enough for him to hear. Matthew's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the people around them, who were beginning to stare. He leaned closer, his voice low. "This isn't the time or place. You need to leave, Clara. You're making a scene." Clara shook her head, her eyes stinging. "I don't care if it's a scene. They're your kids. You owe them something, and you can't just run away." Her voice rose, loud enough for people around to hear. "You're abandoning your own children." People began to gather, the curiosity palpable. Matthew's new wife looked at Clara, her face flushed with confusion and annoyance. "Who is she?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "Matthew, what's going on?" Matthew clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing. He glanced at his wife, then at Clara, his voice cold. "She's no one, just someone from the past. She doesn't matter." Clara's heart twisted painfully at his words. "No one," she repeated, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. She turned to the people around them, her voice rising. "I'm not no one. I'm the mother of his children. He's their father, and he's trying to run away from them." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, people exchanging glances, some even pulling out their phones to record. Matthew looked around, his face reddening with anger and embarrassment. He stepped forward, grabbing Clara's arm roughly. "You need to stop this," he hissed. Clara pulled her arm free, her eyes blazing. "No, I won't. Not until you acknowledge them. Look at them, Matthew. They're your kids. You can't just pretend they don't exist." Matthew looked at the triplets, their wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. He glanced back at his wife, who was staring at him, her expression one of shock and disbelief. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice cold. Matthew hesitated, his jaw clenching. He looked back at Clara, his face hardening. "It doesn't matter," he snapped. "She's just trying to get money from me. She's lying." Clara felt her chest tighten, the pain almost unbearable. She pulled out a folded envelope from her bag, her hands trembling. She held it out to him. "I have the documents, Matthew. They prove you're their father. You can't deny it. If you won't help, I'll take this to court." Matthew stared at the envelope, his face paling slightly. He looked at the crowd around them, the phones pointed at him, the whispers growing louder. His wife stepped back, her face filled with disgust. "Matthew, what is she talking about?" she demanded. Matthew took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing at Clara. "Fine," he said, his voice low, filled with anger. "What do you want?" Clara swallowed, her heart pounding. "I want you to help. I want you to take responsibility for your children. They deserve that much." Matthew looked at her for a long moment, his eyes cold. Finally, he nodded, his jaw tight. "Fine. I'll send money. I'll do what I can. Just leave now. Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her, her knees almost giving out from the exhaustion and stress. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Thank you. Matthew turned away, his face hard, his wife still staring at him with shock and disbelief. Clara looked down at her children, their wide eyes filled with confusion. She knelt, pulling them into her arms, holding them tightly. It's okay, babies, she whispered, her voice breaking. We're going to be okay now. She stood, her legs shaky, her heart heavy but a small weight lifted. She had done it. She had fought for them. And even though it wasn't perfect, even though it wasn't everything they deserved, it was something. It was enough to give them a chance. She took a deep breath, turning away from the crowd, leading her children away from the scene. People were still whispering, their eyes following her, but Clara ignored them. She didn't care what they thought. All that mattered was that she had done what she needed to do for her children. They walked through the airport, the noise and chaos of the terminal fading into the background. Clara held the kids close, her eyes stinging with tears that she didn't let fall. She had fought for them, and she had won. Maybe it wasn't the victory she had imagined, but it was enough. Mommy, are we going home now? Lila asked, her small hand holding tightly to Clara's. Clara nodded, her voice soft. Yes, baby, we're going home. They left the airport, the cold air hitting Clara's face as they stepped outside. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding but lighter than it had been in weeks. She looked down at her children, their faces filled with trust and love. It was enough. It had to be enough. Clara led them to the bus stop, her steps steady, her head held high. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. She had faced her fear, stood up for her children, and she had come out the other side. They would be okay. Maybe they wouldn't have everything, but they would have each other, and that was more than enough for Clara. The bus pulled up, and they climbed on, the children settling beside her, their heads resting on her shoulders. Clara looked out the window, the city lights blurring as the bus moved through the streets. She closed her eyes, her heart full of love for the 3 small lives beside her. They were going to be okay. Clara's hands were shaking as she unlocked the door to their apartment. It was late, and the triplets were quiet, tired from the long day and all the emotions that came with it. They trudged in after her, rubbing their eyes, too sleepy to say much. Clara closed the door behind them, the familiar creak of the wood settling like a reminder of everything they'd been through today. She set down the small bag she'd carried to the airport, looking around at the small apartment. It was still theirs, for now. She walked over to the kitchen, the eviction notice still there on the counter, stark against the chipped wood. It wasn't over, not yet, but at least now she had a promise, one she intended to make sure Matthew kept. Clara gathered herself, her heart heavy but determined. She went over to the triplets, kneeling in front of them, brushing their hair back, her hands gentle. "You did so good today," she said, her voice soft. She could see the confusion in their eyes, the questions they didn't quite know how to ask. She pulled them close, wrapping her arms around their small bodies, holding them tightly. "Mommy loves you more than anything. You know that, right?" They nodded, Lucas' hand clutching the fabric of her jacket, Lila resting her head on Clara's shoulder. Clara closed her eyes, letting the warmth of them steady her. They were safe. That's what mattered now. After a few moments, she stood, leading them to their small bedroom. She helped them change into their pajamas, her fingers moving slowly, the exhaustion of the day weighing down her entire body. The kids were already half asleep, their little heads drooping as she tucked them in. "Mommy," Leo's voice was small, barely above a whisper. "Yes, baby," Clara said, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Are we gonna see Daddy again?" he asked, his eyes half open, his voice filled with a kind of hope that made Clara's heart twist. Clara paused, her breath catching. She knelt by his bed, her eyes meeting his. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said honestly, her voice trembling. "But I promise you that everything is going to be okay. I'm going to take care of you." Leo nodded, his eyes drifting closed. Clara stayed there for a moment, watching them, her heart heavy but resolved. She had done what she needed to do. She had faced him, made him acknowledge them. It wasn't the perfect solution. It wasn't even close, but it was enough for now. When the kids were finally asleep, Clara went back to the kitchen. She picked up the eviction notice, her eyes scanning the words again. She needed money, enough to cover the rent, enough to keep them here. Matthew's promise was still fresh, and she hoped it would be enough. She would find a way to make him stick to it. She took a deep breath, reaching for her phone. She dialed Matthew's number, her hands trembling as she held the phone to her ear. She needed to know he was going to follow through. It rang twice before he answered, his voice low and irritated. "What do you want, Clara?" he said. Clara clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay calm. "I need you to keep your promise, Matthew. The rent is due, and I can't afford to wait. The kids need a home. I need to know you're going to send the money." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Clara could hear the faint sounds of the airport, the announcements echoing in the background. She felt her heart pounding, her breath caught in her throat. "Fine," Matthew finally said, his voice clipped. "I'll send something. Just stop calling me." Clara closed her eyes, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. She hung up before he could say anything else, her heart heavy but a little lighter than it had been. She sat at the small kitchen table, her head in her hands. It wasn't much. It wasn't what she wanted for her children, but it was something. It was enough to give them some stability, enough to keep a roof over their heads. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of small feet pattering across the floor. She opened her eyes, the soft morning light filtering through the curtain. Lila was standing beside the bed, her eyes wide, her hands clutching her worn-out stuffed bear. "Mommy, I'm hungry," she said, her voice sleepy. Clara smiled, her heart swelling with love for her children. She sat up, reaching out to pull Lila into her lap. "Let's get some breakfast, okay?" She got up, moving to the kitchen, Lila trailing after her. She opened the fridge, her eyes scanning the near-empty shelves. There wasn't much, but it would be enough for today. Clara pulled out a carton of eggs and some bread, her mind already calculating what they could eat for dinner. As she started cooking, the other two woke up, shuffling into the kitchen, rubbing their eyes. Clara smiled at them, her heart aching with the fierce love she felt for them. She plated the scrambled eggs, setting the plates down in front of them. "Here you go, kiddos," she said, her voice soft. She watched as they started eating, their faces lighting up at the simple meal. She didn't have much, but she had them, and that was what mattered. Later that day, Clara decided to take the kids out. They needed a break, something to take their minds off everything that had happened. She packed a small bag, throwing in some water bottles and crackers, and led them out of the apartment. They went to the park down the street, the sun shining brightly above, the air crisp and cool. Clara watched as the triplets ran across the grass, their laughter ringing out. It was the first time in days that she had heard them laugh like that, and it filled her chest with a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. She sat on a bench, her eyes following them as they played, her heart swelling. She didn't know what the future held. She still didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing. She was going to keep fighting for them. She was going to give them everything she could, no matter what. "Mommy, look!" Lucas called, his face lighting up as he held up a small flower he'd picked. He ran over to her, his smile wide, his eyes bright with joy. Clara took the flower, her heart feeling lighter than it had in days. She pulled him into a hug, her eyes stinging with tears. "Thank you, baby," she whispered. Lucas looked up at her, his eyes wide. "Are you happy, Mommy?" Clara nodded, her throat tight. She looked at him, then at Lila and Leo, who were running across the grass, their laughter filling the air. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft. "I'm happy." And for the first time in a long time, she realized it was true. It wasn't perfect. There was still so much to do, so much to fight for. But she had her children, and they were safe, and that was enough. It had to be enough. Clara stayed at the park with the kids until the sun began to dip below the horizon, the sky turning shades of pink and orange. She called them over, gathering them close, her heart full. They walked back to the apartment, the triplets holding her hands, their small fingers wrapped around hers. When they got home, there was a notice on the door. Clara felt her heart skip a beat, her hands trembling as she took it down. She opened it, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't an eviction notice, it was a receipt, proof of payment. Matthew had sent the money. Clara closed her eyes, a sigh of relief escaping her lips. She looked down at her children, their eyes curious. "Is everything okay, Mommy?" Lila asked. Clara knelt, pulling them into her arms, her heart swelling with love. "Yes, babies," she said, her voice breaking. "Everything's going to be okay." And as she held them close, she knew she meant it. She was going to keep fighting, keep doing everything she could for them. They had a home, they had each other, and for now, that was enough. The following days felt different. There was still a sense of uncertainty in Clara's life. but the weight that had been pressing down on her chest for weeks had lightened. There was no longer a threat of eviction hanging over her head, no immediate fear of losing the small apartment she and her children called home. It was a modest victory, but to Clara, it felt monumental. She woke up earlier than usual one morning, the faint light of dawn seeping through the curtains. The apartment was quiet, the triplets still asleep in their room. Clara moved carefully through the space, tiptoeing so as not to wake them. She went into the kitchen, put on a pot of coffee, and sat down at the table, taking a deep breath. She let the quietness settle over her heart feeling more at peace than it had in a long time. As she sipped her coffee, Clara thought about what came next. She still had to work. She still needed to find a way to make ends meet, to provide for her children. Matthew's money was a help, but it wasn't a permanent solution. She would have to figure out a long-term plan, but for now, she was content with the fact that they were safe. She looked over at the crumpled eviction notice still lying on the counter, now stamped with "Paid" in red letters. Clara reached for it, smoothing it out, her fingers tracing over the bold letters. She had done it. She had kept them from losing their home, from losing everything, and though it hadn't been easy, she had fought, and she had won. It was a small but crucial step forward. The triplets stirred awake as the sun rose higher. Clara heard their sleepy voices from the bedroom, and she smiled, setting her mug down. She went to them, finding Lila rubbing her eyes, Lucas and Leo still tangled in their blankets. "Good morning, my loves," she said softly, sitting on the edge of their bed. She leaned down, kissing the top of each of their heads. "How about some breakfast?" They all nodded, still groggy, and Clara helped them out of bed, getting them dressed. She led them to the kitchen, and they sat at the table as she cooked scrambled eggs. She hummed to herself, flipping the eggs, listening to the soft chatter of her children as they talked about what they wanted to do today. "Can we go back to the park, Mommy?" Lucas asked, his eyes lighting up. Clara turned, smiling at him. "Maybe later, sweetheart, but first, Mommy has to do some things, okay?" She plated the eggs, setting the plates in front of them, watching as they dug in, their laughter filling the small space. It wasn't much. Breakfast was simple. The apartment was cramped, but it was theirs, and it was enough. After breakfast, Clara decided it was time to take the next step forward. She couldn't keep working at the supermarket forever. The pay was barely enough to cover their basic needs. She needed something better, something more stable. She had always been good at taking care of people, always had a knack for keeping things running smoothly, and she thought maybe that could translate into something more. She got the kids dressed in their outdoor clothes, bundling them up warmly before heading out. She brought them to Mrs. Lopez's apartment, knocking lightly on the door. Mrs. Lopez opened it, her face lighting up at the sight of them. "Clara, and my little darlings," Mrs. Lopez said warmly, stepping aside to let them in. She bent down, giving each of the triplets a hug. "What brings you all here this morning?" Clara smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude for Mrs. Lopez's kindness. "I was hoping you could watch them for a little while," she said, her voice careful. "I have to go into town to take care of something." Mrs. Lopez straightened, nodding knowingly. "Of course, Clara. They're always welcome here. You do what you need to do." Clara knelt, hugging each of her children, kissing their cheeks. "You be good for Mrs. Lopez, okay?" she said, her voice steady. The triplets nodded, their eyes wide and trusting. Clara stood, giving Mrs. Lopez a grateful smile before turning to leave. She took the bus into town, her hands resting in her lap, her fingers tapping nervously. She wasn't entirely sure where to start, but she knew she had to do something. Clara got off at the main stop, walking through the busy streets, her eyes scanning the building, the signs, the people. She found herself standing outside a small nursing home, the sign above the door reading Sunshine Care Center. Clara hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding. She took a deep breath, stepping inside, the doorbell chiming softly as she walked in. The receptionist looked up, giving her a polite smile. "Can I help you?" Clara cleared her throat, her voice trembling slightly. "I was wondering if you were hiring. I'm looking for work." The receptionist's smile widened slightly, and she nodded. "Actually, we are. We've been looking for an aide, someone to help with the residents, assist with meals and daily care. Do you have any experience?" Clara nodded, her heart lifting a little. "I do. I've got kids, triplets actually, and I've been a caretaker all my life. I know how to take care of people." The receptionist smiled again, her eyes softening. "Well, that's definitely experience we value. Let me get you an application, and we can go from there." Clara took the form, her hands trembling slightly as she filled it out. She had never done anything like this before, but she knew she could do it. She had to, for her children. She finished the form, handing it back to the receptionist, who nodded. "We'll give you a call soon," she said kindly. Clara thanked her, leaving the building, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a start, a step forward, something new. She took a deep breath, looking up at the clear blue sky, the sun shining bright above her. It felt like hope. She went back to Mrs. Lopez's apartment, picking up the kids, their small faces lighting up when they saw her. She gathered them close, her heart swelling with love. "Did you have fun with Mrs. Lopez?" she asked, her voice light. "Yes, Mommy," Lila said, her face bright with a smile. "We made cookies," Clara laughed, her heart warming. She looked at Mrs. Lopez, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, really," she said softly. Mrs. Lopez waved her hand, smiling. "You don't have to thank me, Clara. You're doing everything you can for these little ones. You're a good mother." Clara's throat tightened, and she nodded, her eyes stinging with tears. She led the kids back to their apartment, her heart feeling lighter with each step. They spent the rest of the day together, playing, laughing, enjoying each other's company. Clara took them to the park in the late afternoon, the sun setting in warm hues, the triplets running across the grass, their laughter echoing in the cool air. She watched them, her heart full. When they got home that evening, Clara received a call. She answered, her breath catching when she heard the voice on the other end. "Mrs. Lopez?" the voice said. "This is Sunshine Care Center. We'd like to offer you the position as an aide." Clara's heart swelled, her eyes filling with tears of relief and gratitude. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, thank you." She hung up, turning to her children, who were looking at her, curious. Clara knelt down, her hands on their shoulders, her eyes filled with tears. "Mommy got a new job," she said, her voice trembling. "Does that mean we're gonna be okay?" Lucas asked, his eyes wide. Clara pulled them into a hug, her heart full. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "We're going to be okay, I promise." As she held them, she knew she meant it. The future was still uncertain, but she had taken a step forward. She had faced her fears, fought for her children, and now she had a chance to build something new for them. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Clara led them to bed, tucking them in, her heart swelling with love. She sat by their side until they drifted off to sleep, her eyes softening as she watched them. They were her strength, her reason for fighting, and she knew she would keep going, no matter what. And as she turned off the light, slipping quietly out of their room, Clara felt hope. They had a home, they had each other, and for now, that was more than enough.